Today's discussion on the economics of field treatments will be led by two authors of that publication. Both are research foresters. With us today are Jeremy Freed. He's with the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program based at the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Portland, Oregon. And Terrie Jain is with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Moscow, Idaho. You'll have several opportunities to ask questions. Both Terrie and Jeremy have incorporated these type of slides after certain sections of the webinar for you to stop and pause and ask questions, and or else to provide some comments and share your thoughts and ideas. So you'll see this slide show up and they'll say your cue that go ahead and ask a question. But of course you can keep in mind that you can submit questions at any time, so don't feel like you have to wait until a slide to finally type in your question. You have two options for asking questions or providing comments. You can do it by phone, and to do it by phone, all you need to do is click on that attendee list on the right-hand side of your screen and click on your hand icon. That cues me in to unmuting you so you can ask your questions by phone. Or you can do the traditional method, which of course is just typing your questions and comments into that questions pane, and I'll read them to the presenters. And again, feel free to type in questions at any time. I would now like to welcome Jeremy and Terrie.
Good morning, everyone. This is Terrie Jain. Jeremy, could you push the slide? Today we're going to talk a little bit more about this quantitative economics information, and we kind of have a little agenda put together. Basically, Jeremy and I are going to be switching different subjects as we go through this, and the first thing is really setting the context. Jeremy's going to really talk about some of the questions, and then look at that. I'm going to focus on more of the ecology. Then we'll really discuss kind of the methods, the assessment, and how we went about conducting this economic analysis, and then finish with the actual results. And then we have some opportunities to actually push this further, and so we're going to talk about some of the next steps that we plan to do concerning this economics and provide some opportunities for further input and ways to kind of maybe improve upon these results. Next.
Okay, I'm going to cover the core questions that we were trying to address here. The questions really are: where will field treatment reduce fire hazard? How much wood and associated carbon can be captured for climate benefits? What does it cost to implement mechanical treatment? And how do on-site costs compare to costs of moving wood from the forest to processing facilities? For how long do field treatments achieve a resilient forest? And what does the data tell us about the climate benefits or threats from a field treatment program from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions?
So I'm going to start with the ecology, and part of the reason is for each of the webinars we've had a little bit of a summary of the ecology, but with a little bit of a twist towards some of the things that may influence the economics of doing field treatments. Next, Jeremy. Well, the synthesis area that we covered in the field synthesis really covers basically the Northwest and inland Northwest through Utah. And what we did is we actually looked at and focused on what we called mixed dry conifer. And in that situation, we had to have at least 2 different tree species. It could be aspen as one of them. And in some places where we know that ponderosa pine could potentially grow there, we included those sites. In places like south of the Salmon River, where maybe ponderosa pine does not exist real readily, we also threw those in as far as Douglas fir. An odd duck, so to speak, is we also included things like upland western red cedar. And the reason we did that was because, different from a lot of the other forests, the dry mixed conifer forests are very diverse, and there's intermixtures of these wetter or drier forest types that intermingle. And so that's kind of the reason we included those. We also used the land fire to identify these different forest types, that we had to use them because it had to cover consistently the entire area that we were conducting the synthesis. Next. What we found is that there's lots of diverse vegetation. These things are very, very diverse. They have a combination of different species. In some places, we can have up to 5 or 6 different tree species on a particular site. There was a lot of diversity in ages, sizes, single-story, multi-story. And we had a full mix everywhere, depending on where you were within the synthesis area. We had all the true firs, Douglas fir, western larch, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, a variety of other species, including aspen. So consequently, it's a really diverse vegetation type as far as the dry mixed conifer forests go. Next. But one thing about these forests is they are really what I call disturbance driven. They have both surface and crown fires. They have a series of insects and diseases, weather, blisterus, a whole series of different things that actually created the diversity or contributed to the diversity of these forests. Consequently, the diversity in compositions and structures made them resilient against these diseases and insects. So when we think about these forest types, we sometimes focus on fire, but in reality, we need to really think of all the disturbances that created these particular forest ecosystems. Next. So even though we had those composition structures, they tend to be in an area that was highly influenced by humans. Way back, even in the initial early parts of the time, we had Native American burning. We had movement come in where we created communities in this particular part of the world. And harvesting had a major effect on these forest types, and that we harvested the ponderosa pine, the western larch, some of the sugar pines because of their high value, which caused a shift in our forest ecosystems. Mining was a major player in this, particularly in Idaho and other places, and of course grazing, and then obviously these large fires, the 1910 fires, all of these contributed to what we see today. Next. Next. Oh,
do you have mixed dry forests?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what has happened with these forest ecosystems is that we've kind of converted from, say, a primarily early cereal situation to more of a late cereal situation where they're dominated by grand fir, Douglas fir. We don't have sometimes in places where we should, the ponderosa pine, the western larch, aspen in those areas. And because we've kind of had this condition, we've actually kind of shifted the understory in some places through grazing or other things, or we've kind of opened it up so we have maybe a more shrub-dominated system. So we have a challenge ahead of us to actually make these forests much more resilient, but also in the same context, humans are a part of these forests. They will continue to be a part of these forests, which may actually give us either opportunities or in some cases challenges at achieving these field treatments. And so because of that, economics is a big player in some of these ecosystems to be able to implement the treatments. Next, Jeremy. And as I show you in this graph, you know, oftentimes a lot of people tell me, well, Terry, we're focusing on restoration. We're no longer focusing on individual field treatments. And in reality, if you think about it, it's a very rare occasion when field treatment is the sole objective. And so you have to integrate thoughts from wildlife, soils, all of these players come into play when you're doing any kind of management treatment. And in reality, when we're manipulating vegetation in these fire-driven systems are fuels. So consequently, no matter what we do, we're actually altering or varying the fuel metrics. And as you notice, economics, including and in addition to forest policy and forest management, is a huge driver. Oftentimes, we shift our decisions. We decide not to place aside, say, maybe some other funding for dealing with planting or restoration because of the economics. And so it's really important to add this economics perspective to our fuels management strategies. Next. So let's talk a little bit about the things that might influence the economics. Obviously, tree size is a biggie. And why is that? Well, it depends on whether that material is going to be commercially harvested for houses or other uses, or is it going to be going towards biomass? Also, the cost of removing these trees will vary depending on how much of each of these different size classes occurs. So obviously, many of us in the audience know that tree size is a big driver of that economics. Next. The other thing that comes into play with the dry mist conifer for us is they're very topographically diverse. We have areas that may be below to 40% slopes, maybe ground-based systems may be more appropriate, but in other places we have very steep ground. And so consequently, the kind of harvesting system and the kind of way we're going to treat the fuels is going to vary depending on the topography that we have. And so that's another thing that's going to influence that economics. Also, as you get into steeper ground, things like soil productivity, some of the dry mix conifer on much more shallower soil, so that's going to be a big issue when it comes into the play. So this diversity in itself offers opportunities, but it also can influence the economics. Next. So based on that topographic relief and the type of size of trees that you're working on, it's going to dictate the kind of harvesting system. If you have a commercial product, you can use ground-based, skyline, and in some places, helicopters. Of course, as many of you know, they increase in price as you go from ground skidded all the way to helicopters. Also, within each of these types of harvesting systems, depending on the machine that's used, can also dictate the economics. So there's a lot of diversity out there. There's also maybe some regional variability in the cost of these different systems. Next. In addition, there's the residue or ladder fuels. In other words, for the non-commercial products that we have, we can do a variety of things. We can actually remove them off the site at the time of the harvesting of the commercial products. We can do grapple piling and burning. We can massicate, or we can use prescribed fire. But in each one of those, these take additional costs that may be incurred in addition to the harvested material. Next. So it comes down to a couple things. One, probably the big thing is the number of entries. If you turn around and you take a commercial harvest and then you massicate, you can do that in 2 entries. But if you have material that you're going to first slash, then you're going to have to pile it, and then you have to burn the piles. That's 3 separate entries. That adds to the economics of the site of creating those fuel treatments. So part of the challenge when we're talking about economics is, one, what is the material being removed? What's the size of the material? How are you going to remove it? How many steps it's going to take, because each step takes time, consequently it takes money. So all of these things play into the economics of actually conducting fuel treatments. Next. So this gives you an opportunity, if there's any questions, we're just kind of giving you a little break so that we can kind of get some input if there's anything. Mary, is there any comments or questions?
We don't have any questions right now. For those that are coming in late, you can ask a question either by phone by raising that hand icon next to your name in the attendee list, or you can type in a question in the questions panel on the right side of your screen. So if you do, again, you can type in those questions at any time. So we don't have any questions right now, so Terrie, let's just move forward and take it from there.
Hey, Mary, I see Barb Wolfson has a question mark next to her name. Does that mean anything?
I don't see any question mark. I see that Gene Newell has his hand raised, but I'm going to unmute him and see if he really has a question. Sometimes people accidentally, oh, he's not called in. I can't unmute him for some reason. So yeah, no, he just lowered his hand. So he doesn't have a question, so we can move forward.
Okay, let's continue on. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Terrie. This component of the Joint Fire Science Project was a chance for us to pull together a different kind of synthesis. Rather than attempt to stitch together studies covering different areas and based on a variety of assumptions, we modeled a common set of assumptions on a nationally consistent, systematic field plot sample that is the FIA inventory. FIA conditions, which are full or partial plots, were handled as stands in the FBS model and its fire and fuels extension to characterize current stand attributes, such as indices of crown fire potential, and to apply mechanical fuel treatments that generated cut lists that were the basis of treatment cost simulation and estimates of wood product quantities and values in the BioSum framework. The green dots on this map are the FI plots that were selected by overlying the land fire potential vegetation type layer that Terrie showed you earlier in a 7-state area that's large enough to require the use of 14 different FES variants. We grouped these variants into 4 variant subregions for the analysis to explore and report on regional differences without the overwhelming detail considering every FES variant separately. You might want to fix these in your mind since I'll be using those labels on the results that we'll be sharing with you in a few minutes. The field recorded forest types for plots selected by the land fire layer were not dry mixed conifer about half the time. There's also dry mixed conifer forests that are outside the land fire potential vegetation types, so we rely on the expansion factors of all overlaid plots for estimating area, but we subset our analysis to focus on the two broad forest type groups that account for most of the dry mixed conifer forests. That's the Douglas fir and true fir group and the pine and larch group. From the beginning of the analysis, we recognized three different perspectives on fire hazard that might concern managers. Without a basis for prioritizing one kind of hazard over another, we devised a hazard score as a simple count of the number of hazard thresholds exceeded. We double weight crown fire potential, accounting both torching index and probability of torching, or p-torch for short. Both relate to that hazard component, but they don't move together in lockstep. In some subregions, more than a third of the forests are hazardous by all perspectives, and as few as 5% are entirely hazard-free. So just a reminder on torching index, that's the wind speed at which fire could be expected to climb up into the crowns. And so with torching index, higher numbers are better or less hazardous, lower numbers are more hazardous. With all the other indices, higher numbers are bad or more hazardous representation.
Hey, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Go back to that slide a second.
I'll see if I can.
So are you telling me that the number of hazards, that right side, so if you had a 4, the red bars, that says that that particular place had all 4 hazards, correct?
Yeah. So for example, in PNW interior and in Utah, 35% of the forests there were hazardous by all 4 of those criteria. They had a torching index less than 20 miles per hour, probability of torching greater than 20%, and so on.
So based on your graph, then on the Rocky Mountains, we had a lot of area that had only 2 hazards versus, say, in the PNW world, Pacific Northwest, there was a lot more area that had 4 hazards, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So this schematic lays out the flow of a BioSum analysis. Basically, you start with the FIA data, which is a representative sample of the entire forested landscape, and we apply alternative treatments to those thousands of FIA plots. Wilderness areas are always removed from the sample since we wouldn't be doing mechanical treatments there. And for this analysis, we also use the GIS overlay in terms of the land fire layer to select plots of interest. Then we model each plot prescription combination to track changes in stand metrics, such as crown fire potential. We track the on-site costs and the transportation costs of moving material that's removed in a treatment to the nearest processing site. We track the value and the amount of outputs of merchantable wood and energy wood, also sometimes called biomass. Then we assess the residual stand for its viability as a continuing forest. We assess it for hazard and perhaps carbon stores to weed out treatments that we consider to be non-effective or non-viable. Then we apply constraints and objectives to heuristically drive the best choice for a given scenario. And heuristic is just a 25-cent word that means a rule set. So you follow a set of rules to decide you want this treatment instead of some other treatment. The system relies on off-the-shelf models, such as FES, Fire and Fuels Extension, the Fuel Reduction Cost Simulator, or FRCS for short, price and cost data, transportation layers, and silviculture prescriptions of the type that are currently being used for fuel treatments, and a raft of assumptions about what makes a stand hazardous and what constitutes a meaningful reduction in hazards. We'll be talking more about those in a minute. Terrie, did you have anything to add about the overall structure?
No, thank you.
Okay. So now we come to the prescriptions, and this first set, I'm calling it the first wave of treatment scenarios, were developed as a result of the manager interviews we conducted as part of the Joint Fire Science Project all over the West. And they came into 3 general categories: a crown fuel reduction, trying to get separation between the crowns; a ladder fuel reduction, where we're trying to elevate the canopy base height; and a resilience treatment, where we're favoring the early cereal species over the late cereal species. And we had a couple of versions of these with different harvest systems. One where we used whole tree systems and assumed a 10% yard loss in FES, meaning that a certain amount of slash gets left behind. And then a cut-to-length system where we don't remove the tops and limbs in the woods. Those are entirely left, and that necessitates some additional cost of piling and burning which ended up costing $350 an acre in our assumptions for the model. Terrie, did you have other things to talk about on the prescriptions?
Yes, and one of the things, as I told you at the beginning, is that often fuel treatment, unless it's maybe protecting particular places, is really not often the only objective. And so that's kind of why we threw a couple of these other things in, like the enhancing resilience. Maybe in places where we had a lot more ponderosa pine or larch or sugar pine, we would want to leave those tree species there. The other thing we did is we chose the whole tree harvest versus the cut to length because these were probably the two common, most ways that are being used today. Lop and scatter is not really the one that we often do, but whole tree harvest is often one that we do a lot of. And so we wanted to kind of look at those two aspects. Now, of course, there's always assumptions thrown into these, but these are about as good as we could get for the particular studies that we wanted to do at this point in time. I'm done, Jeremy.
Thanks, Terrie. And then with this batch of prescriptions, we got one set of results, and those are reflected in the fuel synthesis report, the general technical report that you can get online. But we ended up treating less of the landscape than we'd anticipated or hoped to be able to, at least by the effectiveness criteria that we laid out. And so we came up with a second wave of treatments that are kind of blends between these. There's some that blend crown and ladder fuel objectives, some that are more diameter limit, and then some that blend resilience with the ladder fuels. And Terrie, do you want to discuss any of these treatments in more detail?
I think that some of these, particularly like the crown and ladder fuel cut to length, coming up with the 80 basal area or the something like that, that might have more to integrate maybe insect resilience as far as maybe in the ponderosa pine types, dropping the basal area so that we don't get insect infestations. A combination of, the 90 basal area, but it's only removing 10-inch trees or less. Some of these diameter limit prescriptions that some of us are dealing with in particular areas. So, the idea was to kind of enhance those original wave of prescriptions to maybe add a little bit more both overstory and understory kind of treatments.
Thanks, Terrie. So the point is that none of these are the perfect prescription for every stand, and every stand is going to have a prescription that's right for it. But the idea behind BioSum is to throw a whole suite of prescriptions on every stand and let the criterion objectives that you set for running BioSum sort it out and pick the right prescriptions for each stand, as you'll get to later.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what we had to use from the fire and fuels extension. What we did is we kind of selected the default dry conditions. And the reason is we didn't want something that was too extreme, but something that was kind of moderating. And I kind of took a pondering to a lot of the pocket cars that have watch out situations. And probably most of these, including the fuel moisture stuff, wind speed, live woody herbs, were about they tended to fall in the watch out conditions. But the temperature was probably a little cooler. Most of the pocket cars that I looked at were in the 80 degrees to 85 degrees. So from that perspective, most of these fell into a watch-out scenario on particular pocket cars within the synthesis area, except for the temperature.
Thanks, Terrie. So now we're kind of walking through the rest of that BioSum flowchart, and to show kind of a visual impact of the three core treatment styles, that first wave that I showed you, on just one of the 5,000 plots that we modeled. Consider this stand in northern Idaho with an existing set of fire hazard variables shown up there under treatment none, surface flame height 5, torching index 52, and such. And so there's these three strategies that we're looking at in terms of dealing with hazard. Surface flame height would be of interest if you were trying to suppress the fire, so for firefighter safety. Crown fire potential is represented well by the torching index and probability of torching. And the mortality volume percent is reflective both of some of the carbon dynamics in terms of emissions and economic losses if a fire does come through the stand. So there's the picture. Go ahead, Terrie.
What is the numbers mean? Are they the percent of the area?
Sorry, those are actual index values. So a surface flame length of 5 says that FFE calculated a surface flame length given the weather conditions that Terrie just described for this stand of 5 feet. And the torching index of 52 miles per hour suggests that a wind speed of that magnitude would be required to get fire to torch in the stand. a probability of torching of 96% says that there's a 96% chance that fire would torch given those weather conditions, and the mortality volume percent means that 40% of the volume would be dead trees by the end of the fire.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So we come up with a hazard score by simply summing the number of ways that these values exceed the thresholds that we've described here. So surface flame height exceeds 4 feet, gets a score of 1. Torching index is 52. Well, that's greater than 20, so we don't get any hazard points for that. The probability of torching is well over 20%, so get a hazard point there. And the mortality volume is over 30%. So this would have a hazard score of 3. Okay, so now we're just looking at the same stand, but now we're looking at treating it using the crown fire potential focused treatment, the separating the canopy, and we see the changes in the surface flame length, torching index, p-torch, etc. And now I've got in yellow those hazard indices that are hazardous by the criteria, and in black are the ones that are not hazardous. And so you can see that we've shifted the hazard somewhat. We now have a torching index hazard that we didn't have before, and we've reduced the mortality percent, but we still have 3 hazards. And with the enhanced resilience treatment, we're down to 1 hazard. So 3 of the hazards are addressed, and we still have a hazard with respect to surface flame light. And with the ladder fuel treatment, we address 2 of the hazards, but remain hazardous by 2. So note that none of these treatments got us to a 0 hazard point, but some of them reduced the hazard elements past the thresholds.
You know, Jeremy, and that's probably often the true case in that it's really difficult to address all of those hazards simultaneously, because as you open the stand, the wind speeds may increase, so consequently some of the surface flame lengths might actually increase or those kind of things from the wind, increase in the wind when you open up those stands. And so, you know, part of the idea is maybe not to hit, you know, all the different hazards, but at least focus on some key ones, recognizing that changing one hazard may actually promote another.
Right. It's all about trade-offs. So then the on-site harvest costs that we model were computed using the fuel reduction cost simulator spreadsheet application that was developed here at PNW Station at UC Davis. And it tracks the machine hours and the cost per machine hour for several different harvesting systems, including the ones Terrie mentioned earlier. We computed the transportation costs for moving material from the forest to processing sites using a geospatial model that I'll describe next, and a market rate for truck operation of $90 an hour. Prices for merchantable wood were derived from published time series, and energy wood was priced at the upper end of the range of values that we've seen in the study area in recent years. So location data for sawmills, plywood and post and pole facilities, and bioenergy facilities from a compilation being put together at the PNW Station by Gene Daniels with help from Todd Morgan were used to compute the haul times for merchantable wood and for energy wood from each plot, and ultimately haul costs associated with each prescription. This map of a piece of the inland west, the northern Rockies, central Rockies, shows facilities, plots, and major roads. However, we assembled additional road data from a number of resources, including S3 Street Map and comprehensive road compilations provided by the Forest Service regions, BLM, and individual states to compute the haul times. And you can see even on this map that the roads have different speeds, and we accounted for that in calculating the travel time along the roads.
Hey, Jeremy, could you point where those yellow dots are so that people can see the...
Sure. So the blue dots are the merchantable wood mills, and there's quite a few of those. The yellow dots are the energy facilities, bioenergy facilities, and there's a lot fewer of those. So this road graphic, in which the roads are represented as grid cells, shows the travel time to the Priest River Mill, with the colors ramped to represent increasing travel time along the road system. The travel time grid for each of over 300 locations like this one was overlaid on the plot locations to obtain the travel time from each plot to each facility. The facilities closest to a plot were selected for assigning transportation costs for merchantable wood, if it was a merchantable facility, and for energy wood, if it was a bioenergy facility, that flow from that plot.
So the purple dots, are they the energy facilities?
Thank you, Terrie. Yes, the green dots in this particular slide are the mills, the wood mills, and the purple dots are the energy facilities in northern Idaho.
So Jeremy, when you went to a mill, did you, like, you know, I know Priest River Mill, one is like a white pine mill and another one is a regular saw log mill. Did we take into account for that, or did we just assume a mill is a mill is a mill?
So for this analysis, we made the simplifying assumption that a mill was a mill, and so whatever was the closest mill to take wood to, that's where it would go. And so that does underestimate the true costs of hauling to a mill, because if it's a cedar mill and you've got fir, that's probably not going to be a real good match. But trying to tease out what's on each plot and sending it off to different mills is a level of complexity beyond what BioSum was intended to handle.
You know, what's interesting about this graph, if you notice, it's like a giant web. That really kind of gave me an indication of how many road systems we have within our synthesis area.
No shortage. So representing effectiveness has been what I'd call an evolving process in this project. In the fuel synthesis GTR publication, we presented several scenarios, including one in which all hazards had to be eliminated, going to a hazard score of 0, which was only possible in a tiny fraction of the forested landscape, and another in which any reduction in hazard score qualified as effective. Most of the results we'll be showing today are based on the second definition. Any drop in hazard score counts as effective. Note that if an improvement in torching index occurs along with an increase in surface flame length that exceeds the threshold, there is no net reduction in hazard score, and treatment is not rated effective. So just because you make something better, if something else gets worse, we're not going to give you credit for it. Often more than one treatment can reduce hazard score. So for today's results, we've broken ties first by selecting the treatment that has the lowest p-torch, or probability of torching, and if there are still ties between treatments, then we break them by picking the one with the most net revenue. In the fuel synthesis report, if you looked at that, we also report breaking ties in reverse order, picking the one that maximizes net revenue before breaking ties based on p-torch, and it actually makes a substantial difference in costs and revenues, just making even subtle adjustments in tie-breaking rules.
All right, we have an opportunity for any of people to ask questions or provide comments. We don't have anything in the queue, but do you guys have any summary statements you'd like to make about that section that you just covered? That might give folks 30 seconds or so to type anything in if they do have a question.
This is all the setup, essentially. This is the methods of the analysis that we've actually done, and what we're going to go into next are what we learned from this. So if you have questions about how it was done, this is a good time to ask, although you can ask it later too.
You know, I think the big point too as well is that, you know, as I told you, it's a big question about economics. It depends. And so one of the things that we hope to push on later is here's what we started with, and getting comments from managers and others. What other little tidbits can we throw into the mix to make it more relevant to on-the-ground decisions? And so, you know, take this information not as the final, this is what you end up with, but to provide an opportunity to add more information to give us so that we can tweak it, we can add to it. And in reality, one of the big points that we want to break at the end is that we just recently got Joint Fire Science funding to push this a little further, to look at things a little bit more in detail. And so this is a real opportunity as a jumping off point to further investigate the economics of this. So as you guys went through this methodology, if there's any tweaking or some things you want to add, please send us a message, and we can definitely incorporate it into the Joint Fire Sciences proposal.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, we don't. That's great, and let's move forward. We don't have any questions as of yet.
So getting to the results, I'd suggest you look at your own region. You don't necessarily need to get the details for all 4 of them if you're just interested in one region. And I do have it broken out by private and public. And the forested area within the land fire selection layer that's coded on FIA plots as being pine or fir types are the blue bars, sort of navy blue. And the area within that is rated hazardous by our definition, that is, it has a hazard score greater than 0, is shown in red. And the area that can be effectively treated by one or more of the 13 treatments we applied is shown in purple, and it's quite a bit smaller than the red bars. The area that can be effectively treated without subsidy, that is, it can break even or better, it can pay for itself, that's the green bars. So a relatively small part of the overall forested landscape. This is the last time time you'll see the Utah subregion, or maybe the next to last time, as the treatable area there barely registers. If there's not a lot of dry mixed conifer forest there, and there's not a lot of the dry mixed conifer forest there that's effectively treatable by our criteria. In every case, there are more public acres needing treatment and treatable than there are private acres. And there's a concentration of dry mixed conifer acres in the north and central Rockies and the PNW interior, but a greater fraction in the PNW interior is treatable, and a greater fraction is treatable at a break-even or better price. So here's perhaps a clearer depiction of how the acres sort out by subregion. Now I've combined the public and private together in terms of acres where treatment pays for itself in green, where it doesn't pay for itself in red, but it's still possible, and where none of the treatments we tried, at least of the 13, were effective by our criteria. Here I've plotted the average mass density, volume per acre, biomass per acre, of the merchantable wood and the energy wood produced by these treatments, where we've picked the best of the 13 for each plot, by region and within region by forest type class. So the fir is the blue bars and the pine stands are the orange. There's a bit more material coming out of the fir forest than the pine forest, and there's always far more merchantable wood, about 10 to 30 tons per acre, coming out than energy wood. There's also some of an east-west gradient in wood volumes. As you get more to the interior, the wood volumes are lower than they are more to the west. But compare those 10 to 30 tons per acre range for the merchantable wood with the next slide, which was derived from an earlier version of the analysis where we used a different criteria for choosing the best treatment. In that analysis, we chose the treatment that maximized net revenue. And when we chose that as our heuristic, we ended up with about 10 tons per acre more merchantable wood. So what you decide is your basis for picking treatments, and more than one treatment is going to be effective, really does make a difference on things like the economics.
Hey, Jeremy, the blue is the Inland Empire, red is Southern Oregon, and Utah is the green?
Yeah, so the previous analysis, we were looking at all 14 FBS variants broken up into the 4 variant groups. In this earlier analysis, we'd only looked at 3 variants, the Inland Empire, which is in the northern central Rockies, the Southern Oregon, which is in the Northern California and Klamath, and the Utah, which is in its own variant region. And you do note that where it says chips used in green tons, there is no green bar. That's not because it fell off the page. It's because there are no bioenergy plants in Utah to haul material to. So you really don't have a lot of choices other than piling and burning or masticating or doing something with the residue of the tops and limbs of the trees. There's no viable place to take it where you can collect money for it.
Hey, Jeremy, for that biomass energy stuff, if we had more infrastructure, would it contribute more, or would it be considerably much less than the merchantable material?
Well, the submersible material is always a smaller fraction of the total wood removed than the merch. It's never more than a third, and sometimes quite a bit less. And then the value per ton is very, very much less. The value per ton is on the order of $36 a green ton, and the average for merchantable wood is more like $85 a green ton. So while it contributes some value, it's not a huge part of the economics. It does matter from the carbon perspective, though, because if you're disposing of it on site, whether rapidly through burning or decomposing slowly through mastication or other mechanical means, it's still getting emitted to the atmosphere, whereas if it's captured for energy use, then you're contributing to some climate solutions that you don't get if you leave it in the woods.
So, Jeremy, if you were a person going for it, where do you think the slopes, the flatter slopes, say less than 40, would be a better investment for that material, or would it be good to remove it from as many sites as possible?
Well, that's a leading question, Terry. You can remove it from anywhere you want to, but on the steeper slopes, it's going to cost you quite a bit more and contribute to the overall cost, on-site costs of the operation, to the point where it may make the entire treatment not feasible. So on the steep slopes, in general, we don't remove the small material.
Okay.
So here's a good way to look at the summary of the cost and the value side by region for public and private for the whole study area. So we've got them arrayed as we did before, but without Utah. And the on-site treatment costs are in red. The haul costs for energy and merchantable wood are in orange. The revenue from selling energy wood is in blue. The revenue from selling merchantable wood is in green. And the net revenue is in purple. And the unfortunate thing is that those purple bars are always pointing down, which means that the net revenue is negative. But these are the averages. This is the mean over those regions. So take heart. If you look at the data underlying these means, which you can do in the general technical report appendices, of which there are dozens of pages of histograms like these. This shows for all the Douglas fir and true fir stands in the North and Central Rockies region, subregion, the modeled economic attributes of effective treatments. I'll call your attention to net revenue in the upper right corner. So the mean value is negative, as you see here, over minus $500 negative. If you add up the proportions of the forest that fall to the right of the blue line, you'll see that half of the treatable forest could generate a positive return. While we're on the same page, look at the upper left corner, where you'll see the treatment costs may average a couple $1,000s per acre, but they span a very broad range, such that the mean value isn't really a very useful representation of it. The costs depend on the amounts and sizes of material removed, the distance to road, the slope, residue handling, for example. So there's a lot of it depends pieces in there. And in the two histograms below that one, it's clear that the revenue from the merchantable wood sales greatly exceeds the value of energy wood. So that's a point that's important to remember.
So, Jeremy, so in those appendices that we put in the fuel synthesis, this would be under Appendix, I believe, C.
Yeah.
It'd be good for the folks to look at these and really identify that blue line spot to kind of get a better feel as to what would be, is it leaning too far to the left or too far to the right kind of scenario, right?
Yeah, well, as long as there's some massive distribution to the right, that means there's some acres that can pay for themselves. If the blue line is all the way to the right end of the graph because the negative values dominate and there's no positive values, then you're going to have to find subsidy in order to accomplish field treatment. But in this kind of a landscape, there's at least some acres that can be effectively treated. Whether they're the right acres to treat and whether it's compatible with other objectives on those acres, that's an entirely different question.
So the question I have, and maybe something that needs to be considered, is can we, at some point in time, describe what's to the right of that blue bar versus to the left?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas we're headed in the Joint Forest Science proposal, is trying to look at some of the factors that predict where treatments can pay for themselves and be effective. So
I guess I would like some verification from the managers as far as would that be useful as far as finding and identifying the key structural and composition conditions that would be actually positive net revenue?
Yeah, that'd be good feedback, Terry.
Okay.
So this slide pretty much summarizes how the treatments fell out in terms of popularity. The second wave of treatments that we modeled included the most and the least popular, based on our effectiveness and tie-breaking rules. The two at the back of the pack, only remove the little trees, are rarely best. In fact, they don't seem to be best more than about 3 or 4% of the time. The three at the top of the chart are also part of our second wave of prescriptions and account for over half of the acres treated. The top two are blends of a resilience strategy with either crown spacing or ladder fuel removal. And the treatment at the very bottom of the list is the kind of treatment, the one that only cuts trees less than 10 inches in diameter, that environmental groups are most likely to support, unfortunately, because it's not a very effective treatment relative to the others that are out there.
Okay, so these are from the fire hazard perspective or the economics, or both?
These are from the fire hazard perspective, because remember, we chose our treatments based on hazard score. So anything that reduced hazard score the most, those are the ones we looked at further. And then when more than one treatment reduced hazard score the most, we focused on the one that reduced probability of torching the most. And if there were still ties, only then did we consider net revenue and pick the one that maximized net revenue.
So one of the things I notice on this is that the cut to length is more popular, particularly in the crown thin, to 50% over the whole tree. Why would that have occurred?
That's a good question. I can't answer it off the top of my head. Do you have an answer for it?
Probably, well, I think one of the things, and it's an assumption that we put into FFE, that maybe
the pile and burn, sure.
Yeah, because what we did with the cut to length is we piled and burned it. So we went in and did that second step in the treatments, which probably costs us more money, versus sometimes in a whole tree, we may just remove material and not do that second treatment. So we're leaving some material there that might have contributed, not in all cases, you know, like the resilience cut like Cyril, it washed out. It didn't make any difference. But in the Crown's End to 50%, it did make a subtle difference. And so once again, the cut to length in the assumptions that we made, we went into that and did 2 entries with the slashing and burning of the piles, versus in the whole tree, we only did a single entry. So we left slash out there just by simple branch breakage and all of that might have been included. So that's one of the things that sometimes we often think that whole tree, maybe we don't have to do a second treatment, but it may, because of the potential slash that might be left out there through breakage, depending on the species that you have that you're removing. Some trees have more breakage than others, may actually kind of increase the surface yields, at least for a little while. So it's just something that's kind of backwards in my thinking sometimes.
Thanks, Terrie. So this is just looking overall at the hazard score and how it was changed on the acres that were effectively treatable. The upper histograms show the distribution of the forested area by hazard score before treatment, and the lower ones after treatment using the locally best prescription. And you can see that the treatment essentially shoves the distribution to the left, reduces the average hazard score, but it doesn't get them all to 0. In fact, it's particularly rare in the North and Central Rockies, getting to a 0 hazard. Only about 10% of the stands can get reduced to a hazard level that's that low.
But what's interesting is if you look at it, in the pre, we didn't have any stands that were at the 0 level. So we actually increased a little of stands to 0, which was, I guess, a plus.
Well, Terrie, these are just the ones we treated. So there were some stands that weren't initially hazardous, between 10 and 20%, depending on the region. But the ones that were treatable, that actually needed treatment, that's the set we're looking at here.
Okay, so one of the things I noticed when we were writing the paper is that if you only had one hazard, it was much easier to push that to the 0 level. But if you had 2 hazards, then it seemed like you had to almost do 2 treatments to remove both hazards. One treatment did one hazard and the other treatment did the other hazard, so to speak. And so, sometimes when I was looking at that information, if you had a stand that had all 4 hazards, odds are it would need to have multiple treatments to actually push it through. And one of the things we didn't do with that is that we only implemented that first entry, with maybe the treating of the slash, that combination situation. So some of the things that we think about is maybe some of these stands where we have multiple zones or multiple hazards is going to require multiple entries to get it to a point which may be more comfortable depending on the decision and the desired future conditions.
And some of them, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to get them down to a 0 hazard or even a 1 hazard. It's just the structure of the stand makes it not possible to do that without starting over. Another data summary in the fuel synthesis report appendix depicts what treatments can accomplish in terms of hazards that we're concerned with. So the distribution of forest before the treatment is on the left side of this figure and after treatment is on the right side. And as seen in the means and the histograms, you can make great strides in reducing the probability of torching, improving torching index, and reducing mortality volume percent. The surface flame height, not so much, and for some of the reasons that Terrie talked about earlier. The improvements in mortality volume percent are particularly impressive in that we're able to transition from half the forest having 90% or more mortality loss expected when a fire occurs to less than 10% of the forest having that predicted outcome. Terrie, did you have any other insights about these changes?
That's a big, huge one, because a lot of times we're trying to say that if we do a fuel treatment, when it burns, it's going to be more resilient. And what we're showing even in this first wave of prescriptions that we're actually making that difference using this modeling effort. So, this is kind of first time that I've actually seen some more evidence that maybe we are definitely making that difference. And part of it might be so that we're leaving some of the more resilient tree species, the ponderosa pine, western larch, those kinds that might be more resilient, even within this context of this modeling effort.
Thanks, Terrie. So we have a few more results to go through, but I thought this would be a good stopping place in case there are questions about the results that we've discussed so far.
We don't have any questions, Jeremy, but we do have one comment based on the notification that you guys did receive Joint Fire Science Program funding, that it came through. They were just, this person in the audience was just really glad to hear that the funding came through to move the work forward.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
And also from that perspective, now the people that are listening, pass that on, and this gives you an opportunity to add more insight, because one of the big key things that we included in the Joint Fires is to go back and do some more interviews to really hone down those prescriptions. What are the machines that are being used? How many entries are you using? Are you using a commercial harvest and then followed by a secondary entry? You know, these prescriptions we created were kind of based on my own expertise as a silviculturist and adding what I heard in the interviews. But this second wave through the Joint Fire Sciences, one of the big things that both Jeremy and I recognize is that we really need to hone on the real prescriptions that are being put on the ground. And so I'm definitely going to be contacting people in the fall when the summer season ends and fire season ends to really focus on developing some really relevant prescriptions that make sense, that actually include some integration, maybe of some wildlife species, those kind of things, and then use our FIA data to actually model those particular types of prescriptions. So this gives an opportunity for the listeners to really think about it and be able to give us some more input so that it actually matches what's actually being done.
Thanks,
Jeremy,
Terrie.
we do have a question that came in from Barb, and she asks, did the data really show that mortality went from about 30% to 85% pre and post treatment, or was she reading the graph slightly incorrectly?
The averages are the mean, so that's looking at the population of plots in the northern Central Rocky Mountain Douglas fir and true fir forests. Looking at that population, if we did the best treatment on each of those plots, we moved the predicted mortality volume percent if a fire came through from 30%.
Oops, did I do that wrong? Was it vice versa?
It could be. Yes, that's the problem. Thanks for pointing that out. You can actually tell just by looking at the histogram bars that those means are totally off. Yes, we went from 85% down to 30%. So
I reversed that. Sorry, Barb.
It wasn't you. I think this is the edit I made this morning, so I'll take full responsibility. Thanks for catching that. Good eye. All right, so the last bits we wanted to talk about in the way of results are a preliminary analysis that we did on treatment longevity, where we modeled stands forward in FES to see how these hazard elements would play out over time with and without implementation of that best treatment. And I say preliminary because only some of the FBS variants contain tree regeneration models endogenously or internal to the model. And for those that don't, trees can only grow larger or die, but no new trees are going to take their place. And so new ladder fuels wouldn't develop. So in that respect, it's not a definitive analysis.
One thing I'll do add, I'll kind of put a little bit of a thing in there, is that we are so since many of the variants don't have regeneration, we're actually working with developing or working up this new software called Repute, which actually incorporates into the FES variant a regeneration model that we're actually teasing out and working out so that others within that have these variants that don't have regeneration can actually use the Repute model to install regeneration. And so for the Joint Fire Sciences and that kind of stuff, we're actually going to have some regeneration coming in on these variants using the Repute program.
Okay. So think of it more as a conceptual approach and not a completely baked result. But for the three hazard attributes, surface flame length, probability of torching, and mortality volume percent, far fewer stands were rated hazardous by those attributes over the projection period when the best treatment was applied, compared to leaving them untreated. So the untreated are the solid lines here for those attributes, and the way I've represented it is the percent of the acres that are considered hazardous at any point in time, hazardous by our thresholds that we defined earlier. And that was true even if the treatment was followed by a fire a year later. The exception is surface flame length, which is this green one here. So that treatment actually made surface flame length hazardous on more of the area, and then over time it sort of switched over. possibly because the surface fuels were not treated when whole tree harvest systems were used, for example. That might be one reason. The pattern was consistent when fire was delayed until year 16. You still found that the treated stands were less hazardous even after the fire 16 years out. We didn't run the projection past year 32, so I can't say whether the pattern persists beyond that time. And as Terrie mentioned, Jonathan Sandquist, our FVS operator, is working to model the regeneration for all the variants using the repute module to refine the analysis further.
But what's interesting about those is that the treatments were always seemed to be much more effective than not treating the stands. So our, you know, as many of us say, man, if we don't treat these, they're going to burn much worse. The modeling is showing that as well, even with these variety of prescriptions. But once again, as Jeremy says, is that, you know, probably the big thing that we'll always have, and it's because we'll always have surface vegetation, is the surface lane length. It's part of the equation that probably is the one that's always going to be present no matter what treatments we do, because unless we pave it or it's water or it's just soil, we'll always have some kind of surface fires.
Using these same projections, we can look at some of the implications of fuel treatments for carbon dynamics. There's been articles appearing recently that allege that fuel treatments are climate hostile in the sense that they reduce carbon stocks and increase carbon emissions. It's important to remember and account for the climate benefits that occur both in and outside the forest that result from forest management. And many of the studies that get published fall short in adequately addressing the out-of-forest benefits or rely on outdated estimates or assumptions concerning logging and mill recovery efficiencies, product lifetimes, modern landfill technologies, and energy capture from post-consumer waste. The benefits from substituting wood for more energy-intensive materials like metal and concrete are also almost never considered in those kinds of analyses. In January, in the Forest Products Journal, Bill Stewart and Gary Nakamura published a paper that calculated a multiplier of 1.23 to account for all of these out-of-forest benefits over a 100-year time horizon. And I've used merchantable volume instead of carbon in this case because I actually have a little bit of confidence in our measurements and equations for merchantable volume and a lot less confidence in the estimates that we come up with in various ways to get carbon in the other pools. So it is a proxy. It is not the same thing as carbon in the whole stand. When there's no fire, even with the out-of-forest effects, even when we figure those in, there is less climate benefit on average from the kinds of treatments we applied than just allowing the forest to grow. So let me make that clear. If you don't harvest anything, you're going to end up with more climate benefits if that stand does not burn. And it makes sense because thinning of any kind leaves unutilized growing capacity for a period of time by reducing site occupancy. However, when there is a fire, the climate benefits were always greater on average if stands have been treated by one of our best prescriptions for all times following the incident of the fire. But we don't know when a fire will happen in a particular stand. And we can handle this as an uncertainty problem that essentially generates a weighted combination of these trajectories and then model two different fire return intervals, a 20-year fire return interval and a 50-year fire return interval. And when you do that, you find that if you've applied the best treatment, you are better off over time, having done so, given random probabilities of fire on a 20-year interval or a 50-year interval, than if you hadn't done so. And I actually calculated the break-even fire return interval under these assumptions being somewhere around 100 years. So if you have a fire return interval longer than 100 years, none of these treatments make sense from a climate benefits perspective. And if it's much less than 100 years, then they probably do. Okay. That's the end of the results. We do have a few follow-up slides on takeaways and caveats and next steps and such, but this is a chance for any questions about these results.
Jeremy, we do have one question. It came in at the end of that last section that you presented.
Sure.
This is from Dan. He asks, or his comment is, on the results, it would be helpful to report percentiles instead of the mean. That way, managers would have a better idea of how much bang they could get for their treatment bucks.
Percentiles for which results are we talking about?
Well, in the previous section, those histograms.
Oh. Okay.
Part of the reason we put the appendix in the fuel synthesis, because the main chapters, this would be in chapter 11, we just report the means, but that appendix that's in the back, and that's appendix C, and it's many pages long because it's organized by the types of different forest types as well as the different regions. Those are those histograms that can kind of give you an indication of where those things actually fell. So those are the numbers behind it. So I really suggest that you spend a little time looking at those, particularly now since Jeremy was able to illustrate how to better read those. But that's one of the things that Jeremy and I really wanted to do, was to really give you those certain histograms in that back of the appendix. That's probably the most richest piece of information. So don't be afraid of looking at them, even though there are lots of histograms. They're actually fairly easy to look over by region and also by forest cover type.
And that way you can pretty much pick any percentile that you want to look at. You have to kind of look over to the y-axis and add up the percents of the stand, but you can look at the 5th percentile, 10th percentile, 90th, whatever.
You might go back to one of those histograms, Jeremy, and kind of point that out.
So, for example, if you were interested in mortality volume, as one of the people was that caught our error here, and you were interested in the 50th percentile, you could just add up these bars here, and that would put you at about 20th percentile would be around 40, and then I would add up the rest of these bars here. Probably the 40th percentile is out around near 100, somewhere between 90 and 100, and then all the rest of the percentiles are in that 100%.
And then also, I kind of just look at the bar height myself. You know, if you look at that last bar, you're noticing that the mortality volume is in that there's a lot of mortality volume coming off percent-wise from the proportion of forested acres is got some higher mortality volume versus if you look on the right, it's shifted to the left. So you can see that now you're getting more area that has less mortality.
I mean, you got to keep in mind that there's a lot of assumptions embedded in what we decided as the hazard indices and what we decided for the fire weather. And so, I mean, you can get real precise on a particular percentile, but there's so many other assumptions that feed into this that it's probably more important to look at the qualitative gestalt that you get by looking at how the bars have shifted, as Terrie just described.
Thanks, Jeremy. We do have a question.
Other questions?
We do, related to the climate section that you just went over. They want to know if this person, Julie, asked if you have a longer fire return interval, more than 100 years, is there less benefit to the climate benefit? And then she asks, is that because as the longer fire return interval habitats burn, they become more rare and stand replacing in most cases and longer to reestablish?
The issue with it being that long is that if you're preparing your whole forest to receive a fire, it takes over 100 years for it to receive that fire. The loss in growing capacity or carbon sequestration capacity that's inherent in the treatments that you've done because you've thinned the crowns, separated crowns from each other, and removed vegetation that could otherwise be capturing sunlight and energy and growing new wood, that more than offsets the losses that are avoided by not having the fire kill an entire stand. So if a stand only gets killed every 150 or 200 years, you really haven't achieved any benefit by avoiding that because you've so reduced the growing capacity during that time. Of course, it really depends on what you do with the wood and if you remove it from the forest and derive the substitution benefits and the storage benefits and all of that. Because if you're never doing that, then in the larger sense, carbon is stable. It's coming and going as stands grow and die and burn, but there's sort of no long-term trend unless you're capturing some of it.
And also, we got to remember that, if I'm correct, some of the variants we didn't get the regeneration establishment, which also would this also offset the carbon stuff, Jeremy?
Yeah, so that's true. If we had some regeneration, then there would be more volume following our treatments, at least at some point in time following our treatments. So there would be some reallocation of that growing capacity to new trees. So when we get the repute modeling finished, we may get a different answer there.
Did we answer that question pretty good, Mary?
Yeah, I think if Julie has any more responses, she can send in a note. And that's it for this set of questions, so we can move forward.
Great. So the take-home messages that I hope you will remember is that federal lands do have the greatest treatment potential by far, and that it's the merchantable wood, not the energy wood, that's dominating the value that's produced. And merchantable wood also has greater climate benefits. While it's true that energy wood can offset fossil fuel energy and contribute some benefits that way, merchantable wood that's used in buildings achieves benefits not just through storage, but through the substitution benefit of not using other non-wood materials that are more energy intensive. And even at the end of the useful life of wood used in buildings, its energy value can still be captured. The treatment costs, as you've seen, vary extremely greatly depending on many different factors. And so for your particular treatment and your particular stand, you may want to use some of the models that we've used in BioSum, such as FVS and FFE and the fuel reduction cost simulator, to look at what those treatments are going to cost. Or you may have other tools that are useful for looking at a particular case. This analysis is really trying to look at it over a whole landscape, and so necessarily it had to be somewhat coarser in its assumptions. The treatments are effective on the minority of the acres, at least the way we've described them in terms of what effectiveness meant. But almost any measure of effectiveness that we have used, you never get most of the acres being treated effectively. And in no case, but very few cases are we able to address every hazard on an acre.
And I think part of that problem was that we only did a single entry as far as we did the harvest and maybe a post-harvest treatment, but did not go in the second time to address maybe another set of those hazards. So say a stand had 4 hazards. In this entry, we might have been able to treat 1, maybe 2, but to treat another one to bring it down to, say, 1 hazard, which would probably be always, in a lot of ways, surface flame length, maybe the big one, you would have to come in again and do another treatment. A case in point might be you do a commercial harvest where we did the whole tree, and then that's it. So then we might have had to come in and do some slashing and some burning to get that done. And then maybe we would have had to reintroduce prescribed fire to keep some of the regeneration or some of the surface fuels from increasing in size. So consequently, a lot of times, one of the things that we may pursue in the dry fire sciences may be this single entry versus multiple entries, and really identify what are the key hazards that we can truly affect and what are the ones that we may not be able to achieve readily. The other thing that we want to get from you guys is what are the fire hazards that we really should be evaluating. We picked 4. Are those the right ones, or are they not the right ones?
And for those 4, do those thresholds make sense to you? Do those seem like realistic or desirable targets? So I've mentioned a few of the caveats along the way. Some others are that the way we parameterized things, the fire and fuels extension model may or may not represent your idea of treatment effectiveness, and then the haul cost may be underestimated. We did talk about that since we assumed the closest mill being available.
Yeah, and some of the big problems with the haul cost is our infrastructure. I know places like in Boise, we're hauling them all the way over to Oregon. That's quite a big log haul cost, and so part of our costs are dealing with the fact that we don't have as much infrastructure as we like, and we don't have many bioenergy type plants. And some of the mills, one of the big assumptions for our mills is that a mill was a mill. Well, maybe a saw log mill might be actually further than the mill that we calculated.
And we are losing mills at a fairly rapid clip. In the last 10 years, California's lost about 47% of its mills, and so as they get spaced farther apart, the haul cost only gets greater. And if you're trying to move larger trees, it's getting even more difficult to find places that can mill those in some parts of the West. So
and even the mid-sized trees. I mean, I think right now the mills are re-gearing themselves to do the mid-size. They've been doing that for many years. Some places we can actually go all the way down to like a 4-inch bowl. Other places like ponderosa pine, and in my experience on the experimental forest, I can only go down as low as 8 inches or 7 inches. And so that whole merchantability and how low, as far as the smallest diameter that's merchantable, has a huge thing, and it varies widely across the region and by mills.
So where we're headed from here is to publish some of these findings, and especially some of the newer ones on the carbon implications of treatments once we get all the refinements that we need to get in there with respect to the regeneration. The BioSum model that this analysis is based on is recently being adopted for policy analysis in California and Oregon, and we've received support from both of those states to develop the model and to assist them in getting it up and running for their entire states. Terrie mentioned the new Joint Fire Science Grant that we were lucky enough to receive last month, I guess it was, where we're going to be addressing cost effectiveness in the treatment selection process. We'll be refining the treatment cost model, working with Rob Keefe at the University of Idaho, ultimately to develop an FES extension that incorporates the FRCS, the fuel reduction cost simulator logic and parameters within a module that could run out of FES, and assess the treatment longevity and trade-offs among hazard attributes over time. And the way we're doing this trade-off analysis of treatment attributes over time sort of starts with what I presented here, but it goes beyond that because we're developing a dynamic version of the BioSum model that should be released sometime in the next couple of months that allows us to model a treatment of a stand more than once. So this is one screen where we define a treatment package. You might do one treatment in the first decade and another treatment 2 decades later, or you might repeat the same treatment. And so we can look at the implications of that for costs and for the state of the hazard variables at the different times. And so we can we can model an unlimited number of treatments and treatment packages and keep track of the results in terms of the costs, the revenues, the condition of the stand attributes, and the carbon implications. So that's a pretty exciting development. I'd like to pause and gratefully acknowledge all of those that have helped us in developing the BioSum model and running the FES analyses and collecting the original FI data on which all of this analysis rests. Terrie, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Oh, it wasn't easy. You know, one of the things is that we're really pushing the envelope of linking the FES output, developing the models, trying to add repute to this, trying to go through the BioSum and all that. And one nice thing about it is that I'd rather have us suffer through it as far as being able to tweak it and begin to understand all the ins and outs of these models rather than having the manager spend a whole lot of time on it. So the advantage with us going through this process was that it was a really opportunity for us to really see how well all these standalone models that not necessarily designed to work together try to come up with all these answers and be able to come up with I'm always after something that's at least much more practical in our sense of mind as far as looking at these economics. So all of these people, including FIA, the FES support staff out of Fort Collins, have been absolutely wonderful at being able to help us with all sorts of different things concerning the different programs that we've used.
Thanks, Terrie. Well, I believe that wraps up the presentation part of this.
And I'd like to point out that this has been funded from the Joint Fire Science Program. Also, National Fire Plan was a major player in this from the Rocky Mountain Research Station. It pays all my salary, or did. And then the Rocky Mountain Research Station itself. The synthesis, the publication staff did a beautiful job at getting this through the process. And also, it's not only just in hard copy, it's also on CD as well as on the internet. And it has what we call an interactive literature list. You can actually click on the literature list on the website, click on that, and it'll take you actually to the PDF if we have it. So, and for sure, to thank Mary and Vita from the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network, because they're the ones that have really helped us put these webinars together. So with that,
we do have one question, and we do have a couple minutes for additional questions if people have want to type something in. So this is kind of a two-part question with a comment to follow from Matt. Can you discuss plans for BioSum development and support? Will it be available for folks in R&D, but more importantly in the field? He's thinking teams funded by the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program in particular would benefit from enhanced capabilities for economic analysis of treatment costs?
Yeah, it'll be available to anybody to download. It's going to be posted on the website once we get the documentation finished for it. The data that feeds it, the FIA data, is already available online, and you'll be able to take the data in the format that it's available online and bring it into BioSum. There is some work to do to develop the road networks for a given location if that hasn't been done already. But anybody that's a good GIS analyst and has access to some road data can follow the procedures and instructions for putting that together. So we intend it to be as widely used as possible.
Yeah, and the other thing is that Jonathan and I, with the Repute program, this is just in a beta format, and so we're thinking about writing a paper about, how to do it, what are the ins and outs, those kind of things, for those who want to employ the regeneration establishment model in the FES. So although that's not BioSum, it also is something that we're trying to do as well.
We're using Repute with the FIA seedling data, and while we do collect seedling data, it's a much smaller plot footprint than the tree data. So we're kind of looking to see how representative is that, and hopefully we'll be able to do some work validating that to build some confidence in it.
What was the second part of the question, Ann? Barry?
Well, he just wanted to know if it would be available and in the field for folks in the field, but also thinking about teams funded by the CFLRP program. Would they benefit from enhanced capabilities for economic analysis?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually one that came up in the Washington office when I did a presentation back there a month ago or so, and they thought that would be a really good audience to see this model and be able to adopt it.
In fact, I don't know, as we go through this Joint Fire Sciences proposal and trying to get this done, if any of you in the audience have other input or things that we might want to try, please let us know, because, I think this is a golden opportunity.
All right.
Any other questions?
Nope, that's it for the questions. You guys have any final comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I think the big one is with the Joint Fire Sciences. I am going to be contacting people. We are still focusing on the same synthesis area. We are still, if I'm correct, Jeremy, we're still focusing on the dry mix conifer, or are we focusing on other forest types? I can't recall.
I think it's a dry mix conifer.
Yeah. And so I do definitely want to get more reality check and make sure that we get the right prescriptions that are really the dominant ones. And also, one of the other things that I've often thought of, and it'd be good to get some feedback on, is that we didn't have time for the synthesis, is that the machines and those kind of things, those cost estimates for the different machines, how do they vary across the region? Are there some local opportunities or those kind of things? And one of the ideas was maybe to summarize the variation in cost and machine availability across that whole entire synthesis area, because I think that really has an ability or an influence on what those final costs would be.
Yeah, I mean, as you saw from the graph, the on-site processing or harvesting costs are the big kahuna. And if we're not accounting for that well, because we're not accounting for the fact that in some places these machines aren't available, or maybe some other place has some machines available that we haven't even represented in the cost simulator yet because it's too new. I mean, those are things we want to be able to capture so we can more accurately represent that aspect of the economics.
Yeah, and the other thing we want to do is maybe, if we can, is say, okay, if you use machine A, this is how much it's cost, but look, if you use machine B, this is how much it's going to save you in that, and how well does it effectively treat those. And so I think that's a big thing that maybe we can get some input from the different managers. And then with Rob Keith, he's just got hired at the University of Idaho in harvesting systems. So he's going to be our expert on that, but he's really engaging, and I think that that's going to really provide us some opportunities that we couldn't address in this particular project. Any other comments, Mary?
Just a comment about the PowerPoint. We do have the recording that's going to be made available to anybody who wants to view the recording, but somebody asked about the PowerPoint. So if you guys want to share it, we can also post it on the webpage with the recording. Will that work, Jeremy? Is that okay?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay,
it looks like there's some more questions on the attendee list. Are those?
No, they're just comments made.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. We've answered all of them. So I guess we can wrap it up. And in closing, I would definitely like to thank you, Jeremy and Terrie, for the presentation today. It was really good. And I'd also like to extend my thank you to our audience for participating in this webinar. It's great to have the participation and the questions. And once again, this recording will be available as well as the PowerPoint. And shortly, perhaps sometime today, I'll be sending out an evaluation to you all to get your feedback. So goodbye, everyone, and enjoy your day.